It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I'll be your host this morning. Appreciate you joining with us. You know, Mr. Snowden is at it again. I got to give it to this guy. He sure knows how to shake it up. You know, he's dropped another bombshell. Appears like every week or 10 days, Mr. Snowden is releasing substantive information to the American public. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And, you know, I did an interview the other day. The idea was to try to educate some folks on the rising police state in America. I was interviewed by Jack Spirko. He is with survivalpodcast.com. I encourage you to go visit that. It's called thesurvivalpodcast.com. I've had a lot of activity as a result of that. It was posted yesterday. If you have an opportunity to, it's a very long interview. It's about an hour and a half. But I thought it was an especially valuable discussion. Apparently we have some very similar ideas about where things are headed. And one of the things that it appears that America is descending into, you've heard me all say this before, is that we are declining into a state of fascism. And the reason I say that is because fascism is marked differently than socialism and communism, predominantly by virtue of the fact that the activity that is related to it in regards to what we're doing with the NSA is very much in parallel. So we're going to discuss a little bit about what defines fascism, so that those of you out there who have an interest in looking a little bit deeper can identify what those points are, and you can begin to evaluate whether or not you agree with that position, and if so, what do we need to do to take corrective action. Second topic we're going to talk about is the news this morning that Hillary Clinton has recently scored quite well with a lucrative Goldman Sachs speaking engagement, two of them, in fact. And you know, she's been paid $200,000 per speech. Now, that's a total of $400,000. And my suggestion would be that this is really, I would say, a thinly veiled attempt to kick off a presidential campaign that can avoid campaign finance law. In other words, this is one way in which they can get money into her hands without actually having to put the money into a campaign finance kitty where it could be tracked and where her usage can be focused upon, and more importantly, where they have to be exposed. And so, I might suggest that, but then there's that group out there that would probably accuse me of wearing a tinfoil hat, and you know, I mean. The issue is, well, we'll discuss it a little bit more in depth in that particular segment. That'll be our second segment. Our third segment is that is a story in which the IRS has actually identified who the leaker is, who dropped the news and the donor list into the public. Now, there was a House committee that's been investigating the IRS scandal, as you're well aware. But the National Organization for Marriage had applied for a not-for-profit status, and as a result of that, they had to submit their donor list. Now, that donor list is supposed to be privileged information. In other words, the IRS may not release that information to anyone because it's part of an official request or return, if you will. That donor list was released, and it was released to the chief political opponent of the National Organization for Marriage, a group which is called the Human Rights Campaign. And it became the subject of a lot of news stories. And we know that they submitted it because it was an exact list, and when the list was submitted on the internet, they put it out there as a document that could be viewed. Well, somebody with some creative skill was able to take and lift a label off, and it actually showed an IRS stamp right on the document. So it's not implausible that the document came from someone within the IRS. Apparently, the House and Ways and Means Committee has identified who that individual is. The problem is that that individual is protected from disclosure and prosecution by the same law that finds him or that prohibits him from actually releasing the information in the first place. In other words, the individual is protected by virtue of the law that prohibits the disclosure of private information, and he's protected from prosecution and being revealed by that same law. I mean, the reality of this thing is that when we look at it, the only way to get around this, and I've been calling for this for quite some time, is for the Department of Justice to appoint a special prosecutor. The problem with that is that the Department of Justice is the only agency that can appoint a special prosecutor because they have subpoena power and they have the power to literally be able to prosecute someone on a criminal and or civil basis for acts against, that would be illegal. And because he's a government or she is a government employee, it has to be a special prosecutor appointed by the Department of Justice. Legally, the Department of Justice is the only individual or organization that can appoint a special prosecutor. The problem is that Eric Holder, the head of the DOJ, would be the individual who would have to appoint that prosecutor. And of course, I guess my obvious question is anybody out there willing to take bets on the independence and objectivity of that particular prosecutor? I mean, the reality is we can anticipate that whoever he appoints is going to find nothing wrong. Move along, folks. There's nothing to see here, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Our fourth topic is the Snowden revelation this morning yesterday about Google and Yahoo. Now, these are two very large organizations that we know have participated in the past with the federal government in their surveillance efforts, if you will. The problem is that this particular news is completely different. This particular news, Google and is denying that they have cooperated with the NSA on this, and the word that's out is that the NSA has illegally tapped into their data hubs, and essentially they are tapping in on foreign soil to avoid U.S. law getting in the way of capturing. Well, we'll talk about the vagaries of this. Here's the problem. The state, and when I say the state, I mean the surveillance state, the new fascist state that we're descending into, is violating the law. And they are gaining illegal and unauthorized access that even the FISA court is not aware of. And that places us, ladies and gentlemen, at an entirely new level of desperation and activity on the part of the federal government. It leads us into our second topic, our first topic, which is defining the specifications or defining the characteristics that are those that make up a fascist approach. I posted up on our Facebook page, and I'll put it up on our website, and I'll put I can't put a link to this in YouTube because I found this somewhere, but I couldn't identify where I found it. 14 defining characteristics by a guy by the name of Dr. Lawrence Britt. And in his examination, he's pulled up the fascist regimes of Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy, Franco in Spain, and Sudarto in Indonesia. And he's looked at several Latin American nations as well. And he kind of went through all of these nations, and he compiled 14 characteristics that are fairly standard in the fascist mentality or the fascist plank. We're going to run over those. The first is a powerful and continuing nationalism. Fascist regimes tend to make constant use of patriotic mottos, slogans, symbols, songs, and other paraphernalia. Flags are seen everywhere, as are flag symbols on clothing and in public displays. I think that we can easily point to the fact that we utilize this nationalistic thinking. We promote very heavily our armed forces and what they're doing overseas and how they're protecting us. We push very heavily the idea that we need the NSA and all of this spying and Department of Homeland Security and all of these organizations out there to protect us. It's to keep us safe, right? How many times have we heard that phrase? We're keeping you safe. The second is a disdain for the recognition of human rights. Because of fear of enemies and the need for security, people in fascist regimes are persuaded that human rights can be ignored in certain cases because of need, the perceived need of the state. The people tend to look the other way or even approve of torture, summary executions, assassinations, long incarcerations of prisoners, etc. Now, we haven't descended to that point yet, thank goodness. But I think you can see the trend where we are agreeing that, in this case, the human right of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, in addition to that, your right to be safe and secure in your person and your personal effects from unwarranted search and seizure. And quite frankly, I want to take this into the Obamacare issue here because, I brought this out once before on an Obamacare discussion. They've passed a law that forces you legally to buy insurance, right? And the only way to obtain that insurance is to buy it online through the healthcare.gov website. Or you can do it in person, but either way, you are still doing it through the website. You're giving your information to a navigator, quote unquote, and that navigator is then entering the information on the website because you're incapable of utilizing a computer, and that's the. Now there are paper methods as well, but some of the same disclosures apply. The issue here is this. When you submit that information, if you look at the legal disclaimers and the privacy documentation that's associated with the website and the state exchanges, in fact, some of the state exchanges are even more open about what the penalties would be. First of all, they're warning you that your information is not secure, number one. Number two, that information, any information you submit, makes you subject to perjury. And then thirdly, that information can be used for prosecution and investigations against you. That, ladies and gentlemen, is forcing you to violate your Fifth Amendment right by forcing you to give up your Fourth Amendment right and, quite frankly, your First Amendment right. And there's no law in the land that legally, constitutionally, can force you to give up your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. In other words, you can't be coerced into violating your own protection against self-incrimination by another law. So when we look at the idea that human rights can be ignored, we see that in that example alone. We also see it in the example of the National Defense Authorization Act, where Americans can be held indefinitely until the end of hostilities. You've heard me do this NDAA thing many times. The NDAA states that you may hold Americans under indefinite detention for an alleged belligerent act. Okay? Now, no one defines belligerent act. And in accordance with the NDAA, you're not allowed to obtain legal counsel or have access to the courts under habeas corpus to be able to file to demand that the court identify what you're actually being held under. Furthermore, the idea that you can be held under indefinite detention and you can't get the courts to define the actual belligerent act you're being accused of, and your family doesn't have to be notified, so basically you can be effectively made to disappear. Now, I understand the principle and the arguments behind that on the government side. They say, well, we want to be able to snatch somebody off the street in a foreign nation who's an American citizen. The problem is that once you open that door, there's no prohibition against using it against domestic American citizens either. And it's not, people always argue that, well, President Obama wouldn't do that. Okay, I'll even grant you the credibility on that argument. I don't agree with it, but I won't deny that could be a legitimate argument. What I will say to you is that we don't necessarily have to worry about President Obama. What about the next person in line? What about the administrative agency that takes this authority and runs with it independently? We can't say that it doesn't happen because the president just came out the other day and denied that he even knew that the NSA was monitoring the telephone communications of some 35 national leaders. Not our national leaders, foreign national leaders. So what we can acknowledge is that we have a government which operates where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and they take their cue from the legal authorities that they determine that they have the authority to act this way. And they essentially don't, according to the NSA and the president, they don't have to ask the president's permission. So giving agencies, administrative agencies, or any agency, including the CIA and the NSA or any other organization, the National Reconnaissance Office or any other type organization out there, the wherewithal and the ability to violate human rights based on perceived need is the challenge here. People tend to look the other way or even approve of things like torture, summary executions, and assassinations. I agree, we're not there yet. The last subject here is the long incarcerations of prisoners, which arguably you can admit is happening every day, right now. And the NDAA would be an extension of that from the political perspective. But let's be honest, the incarceration that people are receiving today for the most ridiculous offenses, including, and I'm a big fan of ending the war on drugs, right? Because we spent God only knows how many hundreds of billions of dollars on it, and it's proven to be an absolute useless, wasteful expenditure of life and or treasure of the nation. The truth of the matter is that we have a disdain for the recognition of human rights. While on the one hand we're declaring that we have to give everybody right to the sexual revolution and they have the right to be gender neutral or whatever their personal, affliction or whatever is, at the same point in time we have complete disdain for the most basic human rights which are outlined for us in the Bill of Rights. That of free speech, that of freedom of religion, right? That of where we have the ability to own firearms for our own protection and the defense and protection of our nation, and the resistance against tyranny. That of the Fourth Amendment, where we have a right to be secure in our persons and in our homes and in our effects. And that of the Fifth Amendment, where we have a right against being forced to incriminate ourselves. So the disdain for recognition of human rights is on the most base level, while there's a simultaneous argument that, well, the government doesn't do that because here they are promoting gay marriage and immigration and all these things. But those are not core basic functional rights that affect every single American. You have to recognize that when you affect the rights of free speech, you effectively shut down the ability for the nation to recognize what's going on around it. And essentially the government can now operate in an even more secret mode than they did before. The third point is the identification of enemies and scapegoats as a unifying cause. And I think we can all point to this. The people are rallied into a unifying patriotic frenzy over the need to eliminate a perceived common threat or foe. And that can take the form of racial, ethnic, religious minorities, liberals, communists, socialists, terrorists, etc. Boy, almost every one of those arguments is currently made by our own administration. Perfect example. We are constantly divided by the race mongers out there, the Jesse Jacksons of the world and the Reverend Al Sharptons, right, who are constantly promoting the fomentation of racial inequality and trying to draw that dividing line. On an ethnic aspect, we are constantly berated from both sides of the fence, by the way. This is both sides of the political ideological fence. That, we've got a problem with ethnic along the lines of immigration. We've got a problem with ethnic along the lines of certain individuals, minority groups who come over here and create and build communities and so forth. You've got the Hmong up in the Minnesota or Wisconsin. You've got groups that tend to congregate together into certain communities. All of these things, religious minorities, where you've got large consolidations of Muslim, which is both ethnic and religious. Anyway, you get the idea. The idea is that you identify enemies and scapegoats, and then you create these massive divides. This was the compartmentalization I was talking about. That was more geared towards, yesterday I was talking about the idea of compartmentalization and how that divides an economic scenario where we no longer have a free market. Today, this same characterization or the same concept of compartmentalization separates us as a unifying principle of we the people, right? And we see the government fomenting that. I mean, just the idea that the president gets involved in a lot of these racial issues. You remember originally there was the beer summit over the fact that, the fella had made a comment. The president took sides in there. He took sides in the Trayvon Martin issue. Some of these issues are really just best left alone by a president. I mean, but you've got a president who is highly charged on the racial front, and they utilize race as a claim to denigrate anyone who disagrees with their principles. Well, you're a racist. No, I'm not a racist. I mean, I would vote for Ben Carson in a minute. Dr. Ben Carson, he's a black man. I would vote for Thomas Sowell in a minute. Thomas Sowell is a black man, but he's a critically thinking guy who uses common sense. He has a foundational principle in the idea that our country is losing the anchors of its foundation. But he's a black man. I'd vote for that guy in a minute. I'd take Thomas Sowell to be a president any day of the week. I'd take Dr. Ben Carson to be a president. And I'm assured of one thing. Having listened to them and heard what they have to say, they're corruptible too. Don't misunderstand me. Every human being is. But when you look at what these men and the way in which they carry themselves and the way in which they've lived their lives, they don't have an ideological slant that they're willing to, at all costs, put their agenda into motion. The fourth bullet is supremacy of the military, and I'm going to have to race through these because we're going to run out of time unless I make this a really long show. The supremacy of the military. Even when there are widespread domestic problems, the military is given a disproportionate amount of government funding, and the domestic agenda is neglected. Soldiers in military service are glamorized. Well, I would say that in some aspects that's true. Let me throw you a couple of ideas. We do have widespread domestic problems, and the military does have a proportionate amount of government funding, a disproportionate amount, I should say. The other aspect of this is that they are militarizing our localized police forces. And that is an area which, quite frankly, our Constitution is quite clear about. We should not have militarization of localized police departments and localized law enforcement. That's way over the top. The training they're receiving, the equipment they're receiving, is leading us down a path of a policed state, if you will, in the sense that, and I think, granted, I'll grant you the idea of the cell phone camera and things like that have certainly opened up the opportunity for more and more and more of us to see examples of abusive police tactics in play and things like that. But at the same point in time, no one can deny that cities of 5 and 10 and 20,000, 25,000 people are buying these Bearcat, Humvee, and up-armored vehicles. With all due respect, I got to tell you, I cannot see a need for an up-armored vehicle to do basic warrant issuance for things like, a guy who failed to pay a ticket or somebody who failed to show up in court for getting caught with a couple of grams of marijuana. I mean, it's absurd. They're doing no-knock warrants. They're racing in. I just did a show for you the other day about the woman who was a reporter for the Washington Times who was whistleblowing, and they broke into her house on a perceived argument that her husband wasn't qualified to have a firearm in his possession or in his presence. She possessed the firearms, but he was constructively possessing. And they stole her. They stole her notes, and the person who was in charge of the raid knew that she was a whistleblower on his agency. So they grabbed those notes because it told them who the whistleblowers were within their own agency that she was keeping privileged. I mean, this is an example of how the First Amendment of speech is being suppressed. When you talk about supremacy of the military, we have a disproportionate amount of our government funding going there. But in addition to that, we have a domestic agenda that is in many cases being neglected, especially when we talk about things like the Veterans Administration and the fact that our veterans are coming back over here, and we're seeing all kinds of excuses and agenda to try to strip them of their Second Amendment rights. If they have ever been diagnosed with PTSD, they're getting letters that they are barred from possession and ownership of firearms. They are being adjudged as being incompetent to handle their own affairs financially. And if they don't respond within a certain period of time, I did a couple of shows about this, if they don't respond within 60 days of receipt of this letter, it's an automatic de facto statement that they are incompetent and their affairs are turned over to someone that they don't know, which they're required to pay. It's tragic what's being done to our returning military. The VA is a complete debacle. I mean, it has been for decades, but lately it's gotten even worse. We've got lots and lots and lots of soldiers who are coming back here injured and wounded, and they're not receiving proper care. They're not receiving the benefits that we would ascribe as Americans to that body of our population. Rampant sexism. Item 4. Item 5. The governments of fascist nations tend to be almost exclusively male-dominated. Under fascist regimes, traditional gender roles are made more rigid. Divorce, abortion, and homosexuality are suppressed, and the state is represented as the ultimate guardian of the family institution. I don't think we're seeing a lot of that in terms of, we do see this rampant sexism, and it's oftentimes a kind of a twist on the idea of sexism. Now, it's not a question of sexism in the traditional role. It's a question of sexism where I put up an article the other day about how the EEOC is now adopting this policy that forces everyone to accept these, gender confusion situations that are out there, where these individuals are, for all intents and purposes, you got a kid at 9 years old who forces the school system that he's in or whatever, to allow him to use the girls' room because he considers himself a girl. Those kinds of things. So it is the same, but it's a bit of a twist. There's a brand new policy out there that's called ENDA, ENDA. I encourage you to look it up. The EEOC is trying to, and it's a new civil rights movement, right? And it's based on sexual behavior, and it will etch it into our workplace. So I encourage you to find that. It's on our website, and it's up on our Facebook page as well. But do your homework on that. It's called ENDA, E-N-D-A. The point of that issue is that while we don't see sexism in the traditional sense, what we are seeing is modifications or manifestations of that rampant sexism that is being twisted. And we do see the state being represented as the ultimate guardian of the family institution. There's absolutely no denying it. We are seeing the demonization of homeschooling and the idea that the school can determine what your child eats for lunch, and parents are being penalized. I mean, I just read an article the other day, and I wish I had saved it, but I read so many of them, it's hard to keep track. There was a school system that actually requires parents to now submit a written request to the school to allow their child to be able to bring their lunch to school. Wow. I mean, that's off the charts, right? Controlled mass media. Now, this one is a pretty obvious one. It's bullet number 6. Sometimes the media is directly controlled by the government, but in other cases, the media is indirectly controlled by government regulation or sympathetic media spokespeople and executives. Censorship, especially in wartime, is very common. I don't think anyone could deny the reality of that unless they're intellectually dishonest or they are so biased that they cannot see the reality of what's going on in our nation in front of them. Even the biased leftward-leaning media admits they're leftward-leaning. I mean, MSNBC, as an example, calls itself a progressive news organization. So the idea that we have a media that is insistent on participating and working within these constraints that, and I raised the issue, which I broke a couple of months ago, about the fact that there was a new law that was, or a modification to an existing law, the Smith-Mundt Amendment, which barred and prohibited Americans from being subjected to government propaganda. And the Smith-Mundt Act was originally passed, I think it was in 1947, and then this was changed in January of 2012, where the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act was inserted into the 2013 National Defense Authorization Act, and that removal of that prohibition was made legal. So now the government can effectively work with news organizations to insert or interleave government-sponsored propaganda within news stories. And my argument at that time, and it still remains the same, is at this point we'll never know whether what we're hearing is the truth or whether or not it's a government-inserted news article that is intended to misdirect or mislead or even to create a false premise. This is along the concept of Cass Sunstein's nudge principle, right? So you can nudge society to move by utilizing things like the media. And you can make social change and move the herd, if you will, one direction or another by manipulation under one various method or another. Boy, I can't believe how fast this time is moving. Normally, we try to keep these segments under a half hour, and I think this morning I'm going to just run through these because I don't want to break this particular segment up. If you'll forgive me, I'm going to take a break because we've got a hard break that we have to take. But when we come back, we're going to talk about we're only on number 7 of 14 of these, so it's going to take us a few minutes to get through it all. We're going to take a quick break. When we return, we will talk about defining the U.S. descent into fascism, Part 2, and we will cover the other 8 segments that are associated with this. Bear with us for a moment. We're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we will address the second part of this. I think I'll have to preempt the Hillary got $400,000 from Goldman Sachs for 2 speeches segment in favor of this. Stick with us. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I'm your host here, and we're going to take a hard break, and we'll have some advertising to run through. And when we return, we'll be more than happy to continue this dialogue. I'd love to hear your comments on this. If you believe that you've got some input on it, by all means, you can email me at mike@americasvoicenow.org. You can call us live here, by the way, onto the show at 417-204-5141. That's 417-204-5141. And we'll take your call on the air. I'd like to try to get through this list in the next segment so that we don't get too bogged down in user calls or listener calls. But you're certainly welcome to use that number. You're listening to America's Voice Now. Find us at americasvoicenow.org. We'll be right back.